We are on Chapter 3. We're going to start Chapter 3 today. Chapter 1 and 2 are up on YouTube. Link is in my bio, so everyone can catch up later. As I read them, they're going straight to YouTube. So, yeah, let's see. Brief overview. The last two chapters. Is that recording? Yeah. That's going good, too. Basically, we have in, I think it's 1933, the year, and in the Soviet Union, Stalin has this 5-year plan where he's trying to basically collectivize the farms. And what that means is he's eliminating private property, and he wants everything to belong to the collective. In order to do this, since they have capitalism in the countryside and socialism in the cities, they have to gather up some communists and socialists in his inner circle and go out to the countryside and basically take the land from the landlords or kulaks. A kulak is a rich peasant, in quotes. So if you are a peasant who basically is one generation removed from a serf, maybe you have a cow or a couple of people working for you, then you are the target for this. You're a kulak. If you're somebody who's friends with someone who owns this or you work with them, then you're a corroborator with the kulaks. So anyway, they're marching these people out. They're taking over their land, and they're sending them off to basically start in the middle of they're sending them out to die, pretty much. But they're going out there under the guise of like, all right, guys, we're going to give you a few shovels, and here's some stuff, and you can rebuild. And anyway, so I'm just going to start the chapter. That's where we're at. If you guys want to know more later, you can check out those videos. But here we go with Chapter 3. This is Cannibal Island, Death in a Siberian Gulag by Nicolas Werth. Read to you by Carter Banks. Chapter 3. Negotiations and Preparations. In his deposition before the Commission of Inquiry, looking into the events that took place on Nazino, the head of the Siblag, Alexander Gorchov, summed up what happened during the mission he had carried out in Moscow in February 1933, after having received the order to settle 1 million special settlers in western Siberia. I left for Moscow shortly after the meeting held on February 9th in the office of the Regional Committee of the Party of Western Siberia. On arriving, I learned that it now was a question of deporting 3 million persons. 1 million to Kazakhstan, 1 million to someplace I don't even remember, since it was planned to assign these people to a considerable number of places. The 3rd million was for us, the Siberians. After 2 days of discussion, we were told that there would be 2 million, 1 million for Kazakhstan and another 1 million for Western Siberia. At the highest level, we were ordered to draw up a complete financial and economic estimate of the cost of the operation, and to make it as cheap as possible. We drew up several different plans and submitted them to a commission of the Central Committee, and then the matter was discussed at Gosplan, where our minimal demands, those proposed by the Ogpu, were once again sharply reduced. To give a concrete example, if the needs were said to be 100 axes, 70 were requested, but the economic ministers allotted many fewer. They had probably received precise instructions that could be summed up this way. The districts could just provide the horses, means of transportation, and food supplies for 3 months. The special settlers could just take along their belongings, their equipment, and their tools. The funds allocated by the center were supposed to be reduced to a minimum. When I returned to Siberia, I learned that the final figure had been reduced to 500,000 for Kazakhstan, 500,000 for us. We had to redo all the calculations, start all over again. At the beginning of March, we knew that we would probably have a small proportion of déclassé elements from the cities banished in connection with the operations of passportization. But that we would also receive criminals, repeat offenders who had been released from prison in connection with the decongestion campaign that we didn't know at all. An enlightening deposition that shows how Stalinist political and police officials at the highest levels conceived, organized, and implemented a particular form of this management of populations that involved millions of individuals. Here, we will not go into depth of the month-long negotiations conducted between representatives of the Ogpu and the Gulag on the one hand, and the various economic ministries at the Gosplan on the other, under the arbitration of the two highest authorities in the country, Stalin and Molotov. On the initial plan proposed by Yagoda in early February, Stalin and Molotov had scribbled some very revealing remarks. Stalin: "A good plan, but we have to coordinate this plan with decongestion of the prisons, deport all these individuals for a period of 10 years, and what has been foreseen to strengthen surveillance and prevent escapes." As for Molotov, as a good manager of the Soviet state budget, he seemed more preoccupied with the high cost of Yagoda's grandiose plan. The expenses, 1,394 million rubles, are grossly exaggerated. The deportees themselves have to be made to pay part of these costs. After a month of hard bargaining, the deportation plan was finally reduced by half, the Ogpu's central leadership having arrived to a compromise with regional leaders. On March 7th, 1933, Ike sent Stalin a telegram in which he declared that he was prepared to modify the terms of my earlier telegram and to agree to settle during the spring and summer of 1933 in the districts of Narim and Tarsk 500,000 labor colonists, that is, twice as many as he had accepted a month earlier. This concession, which clearly showed the limits of the regional leader's opposition and his restricted room for maneuver in dealing with pressures that Moscow was nevertheless accompanied by both financial demands and requests seeking to strengthen the Ogpu's repressive powers in western Siberia in the event of feared disorders following the influx of so many outlaws. 3 days later, the Politburo approved the compromise between the Ogpu and the regional leaders of western Siberia and Kazakhstan, and authorized the Ogpu to deport in 1933 500,000 persons to Kazakhstan and as many to western Siberia. A commission was set up to handle the final arbitration of the differences between the Ogpu's demands and the proposals made by Gosplan and the economic ministries. The whole project, dealing with the organization of labor villages, was finally adopted by the Council of the People's Commissars on April 20th, 1933. As the text shows, the sums allocated for the operations of deportation and settlement of the deportees were considerably reduced. The Ogpu received only 251 million rubles, hardly 20% of the amount initially requested. 960 tractors, including 460 used ones. Out of the 2,640 requested, 34,000 horses, out of the 90,000 considered indispensable for transportation and the development of land cleared by special settlers, 12,500 cattle, out of the 30,000 requested, and so on. As for seed, fodder, and other basic food products, flour, dried fish, oil, sugar, salt, tea, that had been laboriously wrung out of the state's procurement committee, a veritable central bank for the country's food reserves. They were allocated very sparingly, at a rate of about 1/4 of the quantities initially requested. These meager supplies were, moreover, delivered several months late, and in an economic situation that was, let us recall, particularly critical. The deportation plans drawn up by the Ogpu leadership and the central administration of the Gulag foresaw at this date, April 20, the following figures: 150,000 elements to be deported from Ukraine, 120,000 from North Caucasus, 60,000 from Moscow and its environs, 40,000 from Leningrad and its environs, 50,000 from the Urals, 40,000 from the western regions, 35,000 from the central region of the Black Earth, 35,000 from the region of the Middle Volga, 30,000 from western Siberia, 20,000 from the region of the Lower Volga, and so on. The operations were to begin May 1. By August 15th, 750 elements would be deported, and the 250,000 remaining elements would be deported in September and October 1933. Just a quick interjection here. They're calling these people elements because, they're trying to dehumanize them, because what they're doing is really fucked up, and it makes it easier on them to consider someone an element other than a person. That's whenever I say element, that's what that means. According to the plan drawn up by the assistant head of the Ogpu's Department of Transportation, I. Grach, the optimal rate of deportation would be 4 daily convoys of 1,800 elements each, or 7,200 per day, 216,000 per month, 2 convoys a day to western Siberia, and 2 to Kazakhstan, with an unloading time not to exceed 3 or 4 hours. None of these objectives were realized. Regional officials, in a hurry to get rid of the elements to be deported, paid hardly any attention to the plan. The convoys set out long before May 1. While negotiations regarding the modalities of deporting 1 million elements were being carried on, and at the highest level in Moscow, what preparations were being made in the field, in the isolated commandanturas of western Siberia, for this new operation of settling contingents. As far as was called, it was contemporary bureaucratic terminology. The whole of these operations were to be coordinated by Ivan Dolgoik, the head of the Regional Department of Special Settlements, who had already supervised the Great Deportation of summer 1931. This young Chekist leader, who came from the town of Bernal in the Altai, had risen rapidly in the hierarchy. He had joined the Bolshevik Party at the age of 18, fought in the Red Army, and like many other party members of his generation, had quickly been promoted during the Civil War, at the end of which he had become a regimental commander. After military studies in Moscow, he chose to work for the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, NKVD. In 1928, he was already head of the NKVD's administrative department in Bernal, before being promoted in 1931 to head the Western Siberia Department of Special Settlements, which managed more than 300,000 deportees. In his deposition before the Commission of Inquiry, Dolgoik referred repeatedly to the historic and truly grandiose role that the party had conferred on him by naming him to this post. Certainly, he acknowledged, the figure of 1 million elements to be deported and settled. I've already frankly said this before. The regional leadership of the party and the Comrade Ike took due note. Initially seemed to me enormous. This was the first time the party had assigned us such a grandiose task, settling 1 million elements over 2 or 3 summer months in regions as harsh as those around Narim and Tarsk. Despite the inadequacy of our means and our managerial staff, we unhesitatingly accepted this heavy obligation because the party and the Ogpu had ordered us to do so. Could we fail? Not be up to the task? The result obtained over the preceding years could only lend us confidence. I recall that Siberia has had a railway for more than 25 years, and during that whole time, hardly more than 100,000 colonists had been settled between Chelyabinsk and the Pacific, whereas in 3 months we succeeded in settling almost 200,000 persons in Narim region alone. Around mid-February 1933, Dolgoik sent the leaders of the 30 district commandants in western Siberia a telegram announcing the implementation of a new plan for deporting 1 million persons without explaining which contingents were involved. Each Chekist commander was to receive his projected portion of elements to be settled, between 15,000 and 40,000, depending on the settlement capacities and the supposed resources of the various commandanturas. We will now analyze the way in which the operation was prepared. In the Alexandrovskoye commandantura, precisely the one that was a few months later, the scene of the murderous deportation and abandonment in Nazino. Of the 30 district commandantura's administrative units created in 1930 to 31 to manage the contingents of special settlers in western Siberia, Alexandrovskoye was the most northern, the largest. It extended more than 300 kilometers along the river Ob and was about 50,000 square kilometers in the area, and the most distant from the region's main urban centers. Tomsk was located over 700 kilometers and Novosibirsk over 900 kilometers upstream, a region of marshes and forests traversed by many tributaries of the Ob, including the Nazina River. The Alexandrovskoye commandantura was accessible only by river boat from May to October, when the Ob was navigable. 1/4 of the district's 4,000 free citizens lived in the town of Alexandrovskoye, the seat of commandantura. Among these inhabitants, the Ostaiks, a Siberian ethnic group that was dying out, represented 1/3 of the local population. Supporting themselves by fishing, picking fruit, and working in the forests, the Ostaiks led a semi-nomadic life, moving from logging area to fruit-picking areas with their yurts and their small herds. The other 2/3 of the population were Russian colonists, farmers and forestry workers, who had been settled in the region 1 or 2 generations earlier. According to official statistics, barely 30% of them were working in operations, kolkhozes, fisheries, or state structures, forest products companies, thus showing their legendary independence and refusal to submit to the central power. Still more than other districts in Narim region, the Alexandrovskoye district, where about 35% of the population was indigenous and backward, that's a quote, was considered as particularly underdeveloped from the socioeconomic point of view. As we read in a resolution passed by the party committee, one of the other peculiarities of this remote area was that since the 1920s, it had served as a place of regulation and exile for socially dangerous elements. At the end of 1932, the district had about 800 of these elements, exiled by simple executive order, by virtue of the discretionary powers given the Ogpu in this area. Most of these elements were repeat offenders, but there were also several dozen political exiles who worked as teachers, health officers, accountants, or other specialists in the local administration, which was always short of trained personnel. To these administrative exiles, that was what this category of excluded persons was officially called, had been added thousands of dekulakized peasants deported into the Alexandrovskoye district during the second wave of dekulakization in the summer of 1931. In December 1932, 2,864 special settlers had been listed in the district. 733 men, 774 women, 1,039 children under 12, and 278 adolescents from 12 to 16 years of age. The outlaws, administrative exiles, and special settlers thus represented almost half of the total population. They were spread over a dozen villages, special villages, hastily constructed by the deportees themselves. The district administration was handled by an executive committee of the Soviets, which was in fact subordinate to the district party committee, led by a Communist Party member from the Civil War years, Nicolas, and from 1932 on by Andrei Vlasovy, who had similar background. But in reality, since 1931, the true boss of the district was Dmitry Sepkov, an Ogpu official who was head of the district commandantura and thus responsible for administering the approximately 3,000 special displaced persons and 800 exiles deported to these particularly inhospitable places. In a deposition regarding the events on the island of Nazino that he presented before the Commission on an Inquiry, Sepkov summed up his biography and career this way. I've been a party member since 1921. By social origin, I am a peasant, a poor peasant, as you might expect. I was born and lived in this village of Karasevka in the Bolotnitsky district. I served as an ordinary soldier during the Imperialist War. In 1919, I returned from captivity in Germany. I rose through the following ranks in the party: member and then president of the Revolutionary Committee of the Village, of the Rural Soviet, and then president of the District Executive Committee. On May 15, 1931, I was appointed commander of the Alexandrovskoye Commandantura, which I set up. For the past 2 years, I have carried out all my functions as commander in full accord with regulations, implementing an extraordinarily complex, persnickety, and usually completely inapplicable set of rules drawn up in the offices for managing special settlements. That was the constant challenge that confronted the head of the district commandantura, aided by the commanders of the special villages in reality. In reality, the hierarchy and the subordinates, the decision-makers and the implementers, were not dupes. There existed considerable room for maneuver within the formal rules that had to be respected. As for the rest, the local officials had to avoid being caught when the center, at regular but unpredictable intervals, decided to launch a campaign of rectification or denunciation of excesses and other deviations. The specific regulations that were worked out by the Ogpu, in which the Chekist commanders were supposed to apply, concerned both the special settlers, also called, starting in 1933, labor colonists, and administrative exiles. Both of these groups had been deprived of their civil rights, put under house arrest, and subjected to discriminatory work conditions, either in agricultural cooperatives with a particular status, there's a Russian word, I'm not going to even try and say it, or in the state of economic complexes responsible for exploiting the natural resources of resources of inhospitable and remote regions. Unlike administrative exiles, who were relatively few and sentenced individually by an extrajudicial authority of the Ogpu, or even by an ordinary jurisdiction, the punishment by exile, which was often complemented by a term in prison or in camp, the specific settler or labor colonists were deported along with their families by simple executive order in connection with a political campaign launched by the central government, the dekulakization campaign, the passportization campaign for the urban population, and the campaign to cleanse the cities of their socially harmful elements. The archives have preserved a large number of regulatory texts produced by the managers and departments of the special settlements. These documents reflect an obsessive determination to set up an orderly and perfectly utopian system of settlement, colonies managed in a military repressive way. No less than 60 very detailed articles governed, for example, the countless responsibilities simultaneously administrative, police-related, economic, financial, military, and educational, ideological, political, and healthcare regulated, that developed upon the commander of the special village, a veritable potent in his fief. He was expected, in particular, 1. To put special settlers to productive and socially useful work, either in the framework of contract signed with the state company or in that of an agricultural or artisanal cooperative with specific status. The company would be responsible, in theory, for seeing to it that special settlers were given provisions. We've already seen what these provisions were like. The production targets, salaries, and treatment of the deportees were special, too. The targets were 30 to 50% higher than those for free workers. The salaries, ludicrous and seldom paid, since the sums theoretically earned were often less than those withheld by the management, to pay for the tools lent to the deportees to construct their huts, for the cost of the pailk, for the obligatory loan to the state, various fees for labor unions, to which the special settlers were supposed to, in theory, to belong, and the 15% withheld for the Ogpu. 2. To implement all the economic objectives worked out by the administrative hierarchy of the Department of Special Settlements: sowing, plowing, harvesting, clearing, woodcutting, draining of marshes, road construction, and other obligatory labor, but also gathering berries, mushrooms, and other products, fishing, and the fabrication of craft products using local raw materials, which were supposed to contribute to development of the region's natural resources, re-educate the specific special settlers through labor, and improve their everyday life. 3. To direct the construction of collective housing for the special settlers. Wooden huts were supposed to be constructed by the deportees themselves, in accord with the instructions in force and the absurdly detailed norms that specified, for instance, the authorized size and number of windows and stoves, 2 at each end of the building, the standard total dimensions 24.5 meters long and 9.4 meters wide, with a ceiling height of 3 meters. The whole structure being supported to house 10 families, or 50 persons. Moreover, it was specified that each hut was to be at least 30 meters from any other structure. 4. To supervise health care for the population The commander must construct one public bath for every 15 huts, with one part reserved for men and another for women, as well as disinfection and parasite control facility. He will take all necessary steps to avoid the spread of epidemics among humans or 50 animals, among humans or animals, and he will ensure that mothers and children are protected. So that's like 50 times 15, and there's one bathroom for that? Or one tub? That's crazy. 5, to improve the cultural, political, and educative development of the special settlers, especially the youngest. The commander will do whatever is necessary to construct schools. In the absence of teachers recruited among free citizens, primary education may be provided by special settlers who have pedagogical training or can prove a sufficient degree of education. The commander will organize libraries to see to it that special settlers subscribe to newspapers, disseminate the fundamental principles of Marxism-Leninism, and knowledge except for works dealing with military matters. He will carry on an active struggle against hooliganism, the illegal production of alcohol, begging, prostitution, drugs, and other social deviations and anomalies. Naturally, in this inexhaustible bureaucratic utopian literature, special attention is given to the policing and the surveillance of the special settlers, lacking a sufficient number of militiamen, one at most per village. The commander designated among the special settlers informants, usually one for every 12 families, responsible for reporting escapes and disturbances of the public order, and for transmitting the deportees' complaints. A system of collective responsibility was supposed to protect this apparatus. The commander was authorized to impose fines, sentences involving labor, and in general interest or incarceration for a maximum term of 1 month, and naturally to transfer to the courts or the Ogpu all affairs considered serious. In order to limit massive escapes, repeat offenders could be sent to a camp, and to capture the dozens, indeed on the national scale, the hundreds of thousands of escapees, rewards were paid to free citizens who helped capture escaping special settlers. As even the top political officials, including Robert Ike, acknowledged, these instructions are merely instructions, as Ike explained at a meeting of the communist officials in October 1931. In reality, all that counts is how the commander operates. And in the commandanturas, there are more opportunities for abuse than anywhere else. In fact, with regard to special settlers, our commanders have only fixed idea. A deportee is an enemy, a kulak. He has to be brought into line. Of course, at this point, it would be false to say that the special settlers are on our side. The immense majority of them remain our enemies. But we are currently confronted by a difficult task. These enemies, whom we have uprooted, must now be transformed into their new environment, without giving them an opportunity to rise up against us, but by offering them an opportunity to redeem themselves through labor, to remodel themselves. That is the meaning of this decree, issued in July of this year by the Central Executive Committee. However, our managers and commanders do not understand this twofold task, bringing into line and re-educating. They think they can do whatever they like with the enemy. We have to display in all the villages directives explaining what the commander has the right to do and what he does not have the right to do. I will give a single example among the most frequent abuses. When a special settler comes to see the commander to ask for authorization to marry, there is every likelihood that the commander will reply, "I forbid you to marry such and such a person, and abuses of that kind are legion. However, the abuses Robert Icke mentions in his speech seem fairly harmless in comparison with the practices that were common in the commandanturas, without speaking of the deportees' everyday life, as we have already seen. Let us return to the Alexandrovskoye district and its commandantura, directed in 1931-32 by Party Secretary Perpetulissin and Commander Sepkov, respectively. In a long report dated January 1932, a certain Speck, an inspector working for the Department of Special Settlements, denounced the savage and inhumane repressive practices used in Alexandrovskoye district. What this base-level official described was nothing less than organized hunting of human beings, in which not only local officials, but also part of the local population participated. The events reported in this testimony illuminate in many respects the tragedy of Nazino, which was to take place a year and a half later, in almost the same places. From May to October 1931, nearly 800 socially dangerous elements were exiled in the Alexandrovskoye district, which was absolutely unprepared to receive and employ such a large number of individuals who had arrived in addition to several thousand special settlers deported to the district at the same time. At most, 100 to 200 persons could be employed there during the summer season. Thus, the exiles brought in by boat were simply disembarked on the banks of the Ob, not far from the town of Alexandrovskoye, and left to their fate, in accord with the motto, "Live and prosper." The most enterprising of them, in groups of 5 to 10 individuals, seized the local inhabitants' boats and tried to go down the Ob to reach Tobolsk. As for the others, they remained where they were, but since they lacked work, they naturally began stealing anything they found to hand, so that there soon remained not a single inhabitant who had not been burgled. When the locals sought help from the representatives of the government, the latter replied, "What do you want us to do? There are so few of us. We are completely powerless. Help us capture the socially dangerous elements and exterminate them." Soon, these elements started attacking the district officials themselves, going so far as to break into the department of Comrade Perepelitison, the secretary of the party's district committee, and steal all his clothes, trousers, and shirts. Thereupon, Comrade Perpetulissin made on his own authority the decision to collect the exiles and send them to an island in the middle of the Ob. He mobilized all the communists, the Komsomol's, and every activist in the town of Alexandrovskoye. Once they had been collected, the exiles were taken by motorboat to the island and disembarked there. One must realize that on this island, there was not a single bush or slightest little tree that could be used to make a fire. The weather was terrible. Rain, cold, frost. They were left that way, without shelter or food, for 5 or 6 days. When these people were disembarked on the island, a few elements had remained near Alexandrovskoye, 4 or 5 kilometers away, and they didn't even know that they were being sought. Perepelitison ordered us to take our weapons and shoot any we found who had not been taken away on the boats. 3 komsomols, Zhidinov, Solkonikov, and Zegovsky were hunting. As for myself, I refused to go with them. Finding 5 exiles warming themselves around a fire, they shot them with hunting rifles. On the way back, they met Comrade Dokolitov, the Ogpu's local officer, and the head of the militia, who asked them, "Well, boys, was the hunting good?" "Our komsomols boasted. We shot 5 of them, and took them to see the bodies. "Bravo, boys," the officers said. "Now get shovels and bury them," which they did without further ado. After 5 or 6 days had passed, all the socially dangerous elements on the island were brought back and let go. Naturally, since they were starving, they immediately attacked the vegetable gardens and started stealing all over again, killing the livestock. In short, they terrorized the local population. As for the local administration, it did nothing. Seeing that they could count on neither the representatives of the government nor the few policemen who were supposed to maintain order, the peasants decided to deal with the problem themselves. One night in September, I don't recall the exact date, around 10 or 11 in the evening, we heard heavy gunfire that lasted a good 2 or 3 hours. I said to myself, "It's an uprising that's beginning." The next morning, I learned that it was the peasants who had begun liquidating the socially dangerous people, and that at least 18 bodies had been found. I myself saw 4 of them, and a 5th who had a deep wound from an axe, but was still alive. His name was Orakov. I can tell you that in Alexandrovskoye district, the number of people killed was very high, for I heard that in one place there, 3 had been killed, and another 4, and in still another 5, Comrade Kostrovin, the head of the militia, told me, asking me to keep it secret, that in the forests near the place where people usually hunted wild ducks, about 15 socially dangerous elements had been shot, and that all the district leaders had taken part in the execution. Despite such savage actions, daily lynchings, cold and hunger continued to push the socially dangerous elements to commit crimes, thefts of livestock, pillaging, armed attacks. Then the local authorities decided to organize a concentration camp about 170 kilometers away from the Alexandrovskoye on the banks of the Nazino River to isolate the socially dangerous elements there. I was made responsible for settling up this camp. I set out in search of clothing and footwear for these elements, who lacked everything. I made the rounds of all the economic organisms, obtained by the necessary information, and then went to the district committee of the party to inform Comrade Perapelitison. Just going to say Comrade Perp from now on. Furious, he told me, "Comrade Speck, you don't understand anything about the policies of our government. Do you really think that these elements have been sent here to be re-educated? No, comrade, we have to see to it that by the spring they are all dead. Even if we have to be clever about it, dress them in such a way that they'll at least cut down a little wood before they die. You can see for yourself in what condition they send them to us here, disembarking them on the river bank in rags, naked. If the government really wanted to re-educate them, it would have clothed them without our help." I transcribe here faithfully the terms used by the secretary of the party districts committee. Comrade Perp, after this conversation, I refused to organize the camp. For I had understood that they were going to send people out there, and that I was supposed to see to it that they all died. Considering what I've just said, I beg you to take the steps that are required, even if it's late. Unfortunately, we don't know how the authorities reacted to Inspector Speck's letter. We know only that in the course of 1932, Perapelitison was transferred within the Siblog's apparatus with the rank of inspector, a post approximately equivalent to the one he had previously held. Rotating directors within the districts was common. And so, with the manhunts reported in the testimony we have cited in this Far East, government officials and activist members of the party or of the communist youth organizations who came to the aid of the few duly mandated representatives of the Soviet government and the forces of order, were all armed in order to cope with the attacks of bandits. As one might expect, the dividing line between self-defense and bounty hunting for escapes was tenuous. Self-defense units of the villages and kolkhozes often degenerated into groups of red bandits, acknowledged an Ogpu report, which mentioned in particular the manhunts activists had organized in August and September 1932. In the village of Tungoskoye, in the Parabelskaya Kommandantura. In the course of these hunts, some 15 people had been killed. Among them were not only special settlers, but also members of their extended families who had come to visit them. The hunter activists divvied up the personal effects of their victims, keeping for themselves the best quality things, handing over to the cooperative store the things that were worn out or poor in quality. This trafficking and the fact that some of the victims were free citizens probably explain why, in this case, an investigation was made. The idea mentioned in Speck's letter of opening a camp in Alexandrovskoye district in order to isolate the socially dangerous elements. There was not, it seemed, acted upon, despite the local authorities' insistent demands. The leaders of the Siblag did not want to multiply the number of small concentration camps, which required numerous personnel. In his deposition before the Commission of Inquiry regarding the Nazino tragedy, the commander of the Alexandrovskoye Kommandantura, Sepkov, referred several times to the fact that very few, even slightly reliable staff and managers had been put at his disposition to handle the situation. The personnel assigned to District Kommandantura, whose headquarters were an administrative center of Alexandrovskoye, totaled 22 individuals, guards, militiamen, and accountants, the intendant and the managers included. An equivalent number of people, including the commanders of the special villages, were scattered throughout the district. Thus, only 44 persons were supposed to direct and supervise an immense territory of more than 50,000 square kilometers, half of whose population consisted of outlaws under house arrest. 19 of these 44 persons employed in districts commandanturas were, in reality, special settlers recruited into the administration because they had some competency or simply at random. One of the rare witnesses who left an account of what happened in Nazino, Ivan Ionovich Alvarov, tells how he was recruited at the age of 18 as an assistant accountant for the Alexandrovskoye Kommandantura. In 1930, my father, a physician in Krasnodar, decided to visit a comrade at the front of whom he had fought in the Great War, and who had settled in the province of Novosibirsk. My father wore a rather wonderful colorful travel getup, in the Cossack style. A fine fur-trimmed coat, a fur hat of the Kubanka type, and a red scarf around his neck. It was this costume that got him in trouble. Near Novosibirsk, Chekists and the transportation militia forced him to get off the train on the pretext that he looked shady. For a year, my father was moved from one prison to another without being interrogated or charged. Finally, in 1931, He happened to be in the Tomsk transit camp at the very moment that they were seeding thousands of dekulak sending thousands of dekulakized persons to the commandanturas in the Narim region. He was assigned as an escorting physician to a convoy leaving from Alexandrovskoye with the status of special settler. When he arrived in Alexandrovskoye, my father was finally able to write to us for the first time since his arrest. Along with my brother Stefan, we set out to find our father, hoping to convince the local authorities that they had made an error. When we got there, the commander informed us that as members of a deportees family, we ourselves henceforth were under house arrest, with the status of special settlers. Since I had just completed 10th grade, I was named a person who was literate and trained in mathematics, deputy manager, assistant to the chief accountant of the commandantura, a certain Kiselev, who was a high-ranking Chekist. As for my father, he continued to serve as a physician. This testimony reveals the extraordinary arbitrariness of the arrests made at random by the most diverse militias who took away the arrested individuals to be deported without the slightest indictment or judicial procedure. It also shows how the flagrant lack of managers allowed many deportees to enter into the administration of the special settlements. The slightest skills were welcome. Let us recall that in 1933, out of 971 persons employed in the administration of the 20th commandanturas in the Narim region, almost half, 480, were special settlers outside the administration proper. More than 500 teachers, health officers, physicians, accountants, and other specialists, all of them deportees, were practicing their specialty in the Narim region's network of commandanturas. How did these officials of Alexandrovskoye commandantura prepare themselves to receive new contingents of special settlers? At the beginning of 1933, on February 16th, Commander Sepkov received from his superiors in Novosibirsk a telegram informing him that he was expected to settle about 25,000 elements at the beginning of the navigation period, that is, the beginning in May. In his deposition before the Commission of Inquiry, Sepkov indicated that, despite this enormous and almost unreal figure, he immediately informed the district leadership of the Communist Party organization, and that by agreement with the latter, a 5-person commission was appointed to search for places where the 25,000 elements in question could be settled. All these officials, Sepkov added, knew the taiga very well, being excellent hunters. This kind of experience was indispensable, since the commandantura had no detailed map of the region. Just as a quick note, everybody, on Instagram, go and follow my Periscope. Right now, it's it's whatever the Periscope URL is, /Carter Bryant Banks. I just say that because sometimes the Instagram shuts off. Ooh, and I only have 36 seconds remaining on Instagram Live, and then I'll have to start another one. So if you're into this and you're wanting to keep listening, definitely go and check out my Periscope. My Twitter is twitter.com/CarterBanks. I think I tweeted out an exact link to that. Let me see if I can just... Let's see, share broadcast. Share broadcast. Click this. Share. I'm going to copy the link and I will Well, I guess I'll just start another one. I think I can do that. One sec. Live. Going back live, checking connection. You're now live. Okay. And we'll do a quick, very slight intermission. Wait for peeps to join again. But yeah, if anyone has any particular questions that you would like answered, feel free to pop into the chat, and then we'll continue. All right. Let's continue. This testimony reveals the extraordinary arbitrariness of the arrests made at random by the most diverse militias who took away the arrested individuals to be deported without the slightest indictment or judicial procedure. It also shows how the flagrant lack of managers allowed many deportees to enter into the administration of the special settlements. The slightest skills were welcomed. Let us recall that in 1933, out of 971 persons employed in the administration of the 20 commandanturas in the Norim region, almost half, 480, were special settlers. Outside the administration proper, more than 500 teachers, health officers, physicians, accountants, and other specialists, all of them deportees, practicing their specialty in the Norim region's network of commandanturas. How did these officials of the Alexandrovskoye commandantura prepare themselves to receive new contingents of special settlers at the beginning of 1933? On February 16, Commander Sepkov received from his superiors in Novosibirsk a telegram informing him that he was expected to settle about 25,000 elements at the beginning of the navigation period, that is, the beginning in May. In his deposition before the Commission of Inquiry, Sepkov indicated that despite this enormous and almost unreal figure, he immediately informed the district leadership of the Communist Party organization, and that, by agreement with the latter, a 5-person commission was appointed to search for places where the 25,000 elements in question could be settled. All these officials, Sepkov added, knew the taiga very well. Being excellent hunters, this kind of experience was indispensable since the commandantura had no detailed map of the region. In a few days, the commission produced a prospective plan for settling the 25,000 elements dispersed over about 30 sites along 4 tributaries of the Ob, and within a radius of 200 kilometers around the Alexandrovskoye, in conformity with the instructions that specified that the contingents should be isolated by marshy zones, making any escape impossible. Once the plan had been drawn up, everything remained to be done. The commandantura had no boats suitable for transporting the deportees to their place of settlement. Once they had debarked in Alexandrovskoye, the large convoys of barges transporting the deportees could navigate only the Ob. To go up the tributaries, lighter boats had to be used. The commandanturas also lacked construction materials, tools, provisions, and manpower. 3/4 of my 3,000 deportees were already under contract with Rybitrest, which is not about to let its men go. Sepkov explained before the Commission of Inquiry. As for the others, they were in no condition to work. I repeatedly asked Novosibirsk to give me enough manpower to construct even a few bakeries for bread, baths, storehouses. Comrade Gorchkov, the head of the Siblag, promised to send me support, but he did nothing. I tried to sign an agreement with the Kauspromsoyuz for the construction of boats, but at that time, at the beginning of March, I was called, along with all the other commanders, to Novosibirsk. I spent the whole month of March there, the trip taking more than a week, one way. This was the first time since his appointment as head of the Alexandrovskoye Kommandantura that Sepkov had gone to the regional capital. Concerning this Congress of Commanders, in which some 30 district officials, as well as the whole leadership of the Siblag, took part, we have, in addition to Sepkov's testimony, the depositions given by Gorchkov, the head of the Siblag, Dolgoik, the head of the Department of Special Settlements, and Makedonsky, the head of the Siblag's Department of Planning. In the course of this meeting, the commanders presented not only their settlement plans, but also their needs and grievances with regard to equipment, transportation, food supplies, and managers for dealing with an unprecedented influx of deportees. Gorchkov acknowledged that the Siblag had received from Moscow only a tiny portion of the resources in cash, and kind that had been requested for the task of settling 500,000 deportees. The construction of the transit camp in Tomsk, where most of the deportees were to arrive before being divided among the commandanturas of Western Siberia, was stalled for lack of funding. The persistent tensions between the commandanturas and the state organs changed with the transporting of the deportees, rektrans, and putting them into economic uses. Ribtrest, Kaustpromoskoye, Zapsibilrest were discussed at length. Gorchkov announced that in connection with the exceptional mission entrusted by the government to the Ogpu, the commander's powers were to be considerably expanded. All the economic organs responsible for transporting and exploiting the deportees being henceforth subordinate to the Ogpu, and the resources requisitioned for the settlement operations. Nonetheless, Gorchkov announced that in connection with the exceptional mission entrusted by the government to the Ogpu, the commanders' powers were to be considerably expanded. All the economic organs responsible for transporting and exploiting the deportees being henceforth subordinate to the Ogpu, and the resources requisitioned for the settlement operations. Nonetheless, as the head of the Siblag's planning department, Makedonsky emphasized, it was very difficult to organize anything at all in detail because Moscow's plans were constantly changing. In 2 months, we received no less than 9 statistical estimates of the numbers of elements that were going to be sent to us. In addition, no one knew exactly who these elements would be. In the meeting, we were told that the new contingents would be scarcely different from the earlier ones. There would be the remaining kulaks, the same group as in the preceding years, Sepkov said. Hence, I assumed that they would be hard-working muziks, bringing along their families, a few provisions, a few tools, and capable, as in 1931, of constructing in a single night a zemlyanka for shelter, even if they were set down in the middle of the taiga. Instead, they sent the people who were alone, without family, without food, city people who didn't know how to do anything, barefoot people with shirts, without shirts or trousers. In defending himself before the Commission of Inquiry, Sepkov referred repeatedly to the fact that he had not been informed, or only at the last minute, regarding the type of contingents for which he was going to be responsible. This point was confirmed by his superiors. In March, Gorshkov explained, "We had an inkling that a small proportion of contingents might consist of people expelled from the cities in connection with passportization. No arms, no legs. We thought we could put them to work in some artisanal cooperative, doing sewing, for instance. That kind of activity ought to be within their competence. But that recidivists, criminals, would be sent to us in order to decongest the prisons. That we did not know." When he returned from Alexandrovskoye at the beginning of April, Sepkov could not help noticing that during his nothing had changed. No agreement had been signed with Kauspromoskoye for the construction of boats, because the office responsible for food supplies had refused to release the individual additional rations to feed the laborers to be assigned to the task. No food supply had been provided for this new influx of deportees, because it was understood that people would arrive with a minimum of provisions, in accord with the rules in force, that is, with food supplies for at least a month, if not for 3. At the end of April, Sepkov was informed by the Siblog's leadership that he would be receiving 15,000 persons, without further specification, around the end of June, and that they would be coming from the Omsk. This telegram gave me a little relief. The leadership of the Siblog had understood that, because I lacked manpower, I hadn't had the time to prepare the sites. Thus I still had 2 good months to construct a bakery and a couple of storehouses in Alexandrovskoye, and to cut wood and prepare a stock of construction materials in anticipation of the arrival of additional deportees. A few days later, on May 5th, 1933, a telegram from the leadership of the Siblog arrived, informing Sepkov that he was soon to receive several thousand criminal and déclassé elements. That's the end of chapter 3. So I'm just going to go on a brief rant. So what they basically did in this last chapter, they have this collectivized planning of what they're going to do with these people. And because they write everything down on paper, it all looks great. They're like, yeah, they're going to have this and this and this, and we're going to send them out there, and yeah, it's going to work out because they'll have this stuff, and because of that, we're not going to write another check or send any additional supplies because everything is just to a T perfect. But the thing is, when you have people in a group, it's like being in a group for class or something. You have like 6 people. Usually what happens is one person does most of the work, and the other people just kind of ride on the coattails of that one person. That's kind of what happens here, because they continuously cut corners. And so when they actually need something, they're supposed to send them out there with like 15,000 horses and like a set amount of tools for each person, each family. They didn't do that. And the people out there are realizing, oh shit, we fucked up because, we kind of slacked on this and they slacked on that. And before long, you're like, well, fuck, we need to meet this quota, and we can't because it's like the rules, they have it on paper, and they, all the math should work out to this number, but they fuck around with the little things, but if they don't meet that number, then someone's dead. So that's kind of like what I get from some of the elements of socialism that just don't make any sense. Anyway, so that's chapter 4. I'll be putting this on YouTube in the playlist for Cannibal Island chapters 1 through 4, and if you are interested at all in continuing the story with me, tune in tomorrow at 9. Please join my Periscope. It's the most reliable video thing, and yeah, I just started doing all this stuff, so I didn't realize Instagram TV was only an hour long, and I keep having to restart that, but Periscope, I will put the URL to my Periscope in my IG bio, and I will see y'all tomorrow at 9.